question one. Sorry. The other is.
But it probably took many years to reach, years of experimentation for that to happen. And I think in the bilateral agreement industry, at least this proliferation is relatively new, but you guys are the experts, so.
No.
Okay. The other is there any kind of international, intergovernmental, or individual redress mechanism on the international level that's available? For instance, what is the dispute settlement mechanism for disputes regarding these bilateral treaties? Is there an arbitration clause that's common?
The best ones say anything, or this is the best ones other than the Thai-Israel one, say anything at all about how disputes are to be resolved. Most of them don't say a word about either how disputes about the content of the treaty are to be resolved, or how migrant worker treatment that violates the agreement is to be dealt with. Almost none of them establish a mechanism for dealing with the problems that they're supposed to prohibit.
Yeah, first of all, if I may say on a personal note, it was very interesting to hear about things such as the flying visa, recruitment fees, and the bilateral agreements, which I have to say that 10 years ago, I think, in Kavla Oved, and Khani was here next to me, we were the one, identifying, talking about, and it's very interesting to see it academized and theorized all of a sudden.
No, you're part of history. This is interesting. This is interesting.
No, it's really intriguing. The term flying visa, I don't remember where it started. I think it's by the migrant workers themselves. They called it flying visa because it's just a visa to fly, and that's it. And where we started, so it's interesting to see how the academics now party here. And with all due respect to academia, really it was NGOs who really documented it and dealt with it. And it's important to theorize it as well, of course. But it's just a personal note. But I have two quick questions. One of them is for Professor Gordon. You're talking about how, let's say, in the industry chain, how Nike then contracts with the factory that deals horribly with workers, etc. And you're saying, let's find the way how to make Nike culpable. And I'm wondering if you can say the same thing about the government as well. So if we take, for example, the caregiving sector, which is the easiest to talk about because some of us, welfareists think that it's the welfare state's responsibility actually to deal with what's happening with the elderly. So is it possible, you think, maybe, to say that the government here kind of shies away from its responsibility, just like Nike tries to shy away from its responsibility, and give it to some recruiters or the IOM or whatever, and now they're not culpable with what's happening with these workers, whereas, it's the state who should take care of the elders, therefore should take control of whatever the working conditions of the migrant workers, etc. So that's one question, and obviously law is problematic here. For example, in Israel, legally speaking, usually when you try to sue the government for lack of oversight, so why didn't you indict? Why didn't you research? Why didn't usually the legal rule is that's not something you can sue the government for. They have their own prioritizing, and they have to oversee many things, and it's very difficult to sue the government. I remember every morning the couple of men said, "Why don't we sue the state? Why don't we sue them?" Because they did. I said, "Well, it's very difficult." So that's one question. The second question, just a remark maybe to Adriana. You talked about the first generation of bilateral agreements where the government were directly doing the recruitment and having contact one with another, and then the second generation where it's a longer chain. And I was wondering, you kind of skipped the in-between where there was no bilateral agreements for several decades. So what happened, regardless that all of a sudden we're going back to the idea of bilateral agreements? That's, I think, an interesting point.
So all I would say about the likely success of making the government into the lead brand is you're going to have much more luck with it in Israel than we would in the United States, right? Because at least there still is some concept of the welfare state and the responsibility for the government for care. We're out of that business. So I think that that's a very, that the strategy has likelihood of success depends entirely on the concept. And good luck to you here, because we're not going to be able to move forward with it.
I think that it has less to do with generation, with time, than with geography. Different geographies of temporary schemes, of temporary worker schemes. They think about that after the 70s, by and large-scale so-called guest worker programs in Western Europe, where they were the largest, they quite disappeared. They became very unpopular for several reasons. And but then this is more or less the time during the 80s in which you have a renewal of those, but where? Mainly in Asia and in the Middle East. Okay, so what you had here for so many years actually was a very, it was the same understanding of, the former guest worker programs in which they will go back and we will, look at the other side and so on. We will not foresee or think about, longer term policies, provided that, as it is a structural component of the labor market. It has been forever here, but not with overseas, from that far away, immigrant workers. So I think that there has been a change in the gravitas geographically, geopolitically, if you want. And therefore you find lots of similarities. It's not by chance you find so many similarities between the guest worker programs that were created in the Middle East. Israel bears many resemblances, and those that from Southeast Asia, which is even more closer to the Israeli case in many ways. So this could be, I think, one answer. The other one has much to do also with different ways of thinking about, the whole talk about governance of migration, migration becoming manageable. We're talking about the managing of migration. Okay, this is a very strong paradigm, quite internationally, or at least in the global north. So this also dictates what are the tools that you will be using.
Neta?
So my question is for you, Jennifer, about the radar project. If I understand, it's based on some legal rule that says that the employer, if the employer has knowledge of, certain violation, that they could be held liable. So the idea is to provide this information without risking the source of the information. So then, it's very legalistic and very much dependent on enforcement and the willingness of the state or the courts to actually take seriously this rule. And from what we know, that this is a very weak mechanism to try to tackle these structural programs. So just wondering, how hopeful you are this would actually provide some remedy.
That was so nice how you didn't say you were just wondering, why bother? Because I sometimes wonder, why bother?
No, we're lawyers, and this will. But
Yes.
it's a good enough answer, but still, it's a very optimistic, in a way, assumption about the legal system will actually carry this on its back.
So I think the reason I have a shred more hope than why bother has particularly to do with what the animation didn't make clear, which is about the peace in Mexico. Because in the US, you got it 100% right. There's a law. This is, the door has been closed because employers say they don't know. The hope is to open the door Although eventually the Mexican NGO that's running this can only actualize it through partnerships with U.S. legal services for migrant workers. And so it has these partnerships, and they have to sue, and so the workers have to be willing to come forward. But in Mexico, there is a law on the books that says that the lead recruiter in Mexico is liable for the actions of the recruiters all the way down. And the Mexican NGO organizes migrant workers from Mexico who go to the US, but they organize them in Mexico. And so they have successfully, in other cases, used their organizing to put pressure on the government to change its legal theories, enforce its law, and so on. So that's the idea of the Mexico piece. And then there's a very nascent organizing effort in the US with these same workers. So the idea is to link the organizing of the workers in Mexico, which is successful, with the organizing of those workers in the US, where they're more vulnerable and it's more difficult. But to have both, not just the legal mechanism, but the building of power in Mexico for the Mexico piece, in US for the US piece, and then the power of consumers, to the extent that's effective, to put pressure on brands to recognize this as a violation of their corporate social responsibility. Yeah.
Maybe just a short introduction. My name is Liad Orta. I'm head of the CSR Institute here in Israel. So I'm kind of a CSR disciple. For the last 10 years, I've been 5 years being a practitioner in CSR, and the last 5 years as a scholar, teaching, researching. Now I'm a doctoral student at the Department of Gerontology in University of Haifa, looking about aging and CSR. And when you started or mentioned that CSR, in terms of CSR, from time to time people are coming saying CSR is dead. This time CSR 2.0 and expect new versions of CSR. CSR, corporate social responsibility. And I think especially I think me and Hila will have an opportunity to explore that. But I think especially this kind of project, which looks into new perspective of this phenomenon, I think we should kind of embrace CSR and not reject it as a key stakeholder for the issue itself. And just to demonstrate, I think the importance, if we would just imagine what would happen if we'll have the same discussion in a business school and not in a department of law. What would happen if we'd have a professor of finance, of accounting, of evaluation of corporation, of professor of risk managers? How would they react, and how can we, via this project or other scholarly work, make this societal challenge accessible to them? And once we fail to do that, we fail in general the whole supply chain of this issue itself. So from my perspective, or what I will try maybe to bring forward to this kind of project is to look at CSR as kind of a way of creating new solutions or new soft laws, and not going back to kind of old regulatory terms or tools that are already been exhausted a little bit. So I'm just kind of safeguarding the Ed Freeman stakeholder theory importance or things like that. That's my comment.
Okay.
Maybe we'll collect one last one and then you'll respond to them.
Yep. First of all, thank you so much. This was really interesting. Adriana mentioned the space between documented and undocumented workers, and I'm not sure how the numbers are in Israel, but I know that at least in the US there's much more undocumented workers than there are actually people coming in through these temporary worker programs, if I'm right.
You were right until 2015.
Okay. Okay. So, but I'm assuming that there still is quite a big group of both. And I'm wondering what's, if one raises the sort of the, the protection of those that come in through these temporary worker programs, whether that actually doesn't create a push just back to of companies to use undocumented migrants, and whether this program actually in some ways might pit those groups that actually have a lot of similar interests against each other. And I'm wondering whether there's any way that you see that they're actually both benefiting from, for example, the radar program or these kinds of protections.
So just very briefly on corporate social responsibility, it's not, I would say that the two areas where we most need to focus, if there is a 2.0 coming, are one on making the provisions of corporate social responsibility more driven by what workers see as their needs than what their needs for safety or decent treatment on the job, than what corporations see as their needs for brand protection. Right, that might not be well received by a finance or accounting person, but in terms of, from a worker perspective, the failures of corporate social responsibility are that they're designed by corporations in response to public pressure and therefore seek to safeguard the brand rather than improve the conditions of the workers, and they don't consult workers. And also the difference between voluntariness and mandatoriness, right? One of the issues of the problems with corporate social responsibility is there is almost never an enforcement mechanism other than the generation of more consumer pressure. And I think it's very interesting, Ilah mentioned the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. You could call what they do corporate social responsibility, but it's enforced with economic penalties created by the brands themselves, but it's a different sort of model. And I think people interested in that version might want to take a look at a very newly launched entity called the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network. You're there? So the paper I mentioned that I wrote, the critique was their launch paper just this past summer. So they're very new. So there you go on that. Radar was conceived of as a sort of narrow demonstration project to deal with the recruitment issue specifically. In the US, I think, ironically, undocumented workers in many ways have an easier time accessing the justice system than temporary workers, in part because recruitment fees can be more expensive than smuggling fees. And so, and also they're not tied to an individual employer. And so I don't really see this as pitting them against each other, because in both cases you want the same goal: increased access to the ability to organize, demand better conditions, and get redress.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much to Jennifer for